So I'm joined today, Ben Page, CEO of Ipsos MORI. Thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
I'm surviving, thank you very much. Looking forward to my imminent move to Paris 3 days a week to become global CEO.
Fantastic, congratulations. And I wish you all good luck with it.
Thank you.
What do you think many people get wrong about the world of forecasting and understanding trends, especially in order for them to gain insights to achieve competitive advantage?
What most, major organizations will be doing is looking at a range of scenarios for the future. So we don't know exactly what will happen to the economy in the next 5 years. We don't know if inflation is going to take root or whether it will be a transitory phase with supply chain and labor shortages, etc. But we do know that probably the world will go on heating up. We do know that the African population is going to be the only one growing, and that there will be more Nigerians than Europeans in just a few short years. So there are certain things there are varying degrees of certainty about different things. And I think it's how you put that together. And that means that we can start to see the shape of the future, but it's inevitably a matter of judgment. And that's why I think building scenarios for the future, rather than simply saying you've got a central forecast and that's what's going to happen, is probably a more intelligent way of going about it. But I do think a lot of people veer between just saying it's impossible or that somehow expecting there's some godlike accuracy is possible, because both of the extremes are wrong.
Over the last year, there's been a high degree of nostalgia, looking back and returning to how it was beforehand.
Yeah.
When we're talking about these, how much does what we had previously impact what we're looking at?
Yeah, I think clearly the pandemic has led to more changes than we might have expected. And most of us probably wouldn't have been expecting to see a boom and a massive labor shortage coming out of the pandemic. Back in 2020, we might have been expecting some sort of prolonged recession. So I think, you can see the busting of the taboo against remote working for knowledge workers in Europe, America. That is, I think, going to lead to at least a medium-term change. It may be that by 2030 we're all crammed back into offices again. But I think in the same way that we've got this across whole sectors of the economy, a massive labour shortage at the moment, because people are reappraising their lives, working out whether they want to do what they were doing before. The pandemic has turned into one of those liminal moments where people where you make it is a change for a lot of people, whether it's because they've started working in a different way, or because they've just used it as a moment to reappraise their lives. Do they want to go on doing the thing that they were doing before? So it is leading to change. I mean, a lot of the changes, though, it's fair to say, are actually not brand new, but they're an acceleration of things that were already there. So remote working, flexible working, all of that stuff, that was already there. It's just being it's going gangbusters as a result of the pandemic. It's turning into one of those events that we will always remember 2020 and 2021 in the same way that people would remember 1914-18 or the fuel crisis of the early 70s as a moment where probably, will be looked back on by future historians as a moment of change. But I would still caution people, because the risk is that we're so close to the trees, we can't see the forest. And the political consequences of the pandemic probably won't be visible for a few years. We saw, massive change in terms of the rise of populism after the 2008 crash, but it took 4 or 5 years for that to really become visible.
Kind of one of the subjects that we were talking about a lot pre-pandemic, I suppose, was around kind of the changing workplace and the intergenerational differences in the workplace and what that's going to impact.
Yeah.
How's that evolved? And
well, I think you've got, in some ways, Gen Z, people born after 1995, are potentially more in demand because we've got older workers deciding to leave the workforce. But again, one of the things about generational analysis, and I've written about this, but there's a lot of generational analysis comparing millennials with baby boomers like me and saying that they're completely different, and Gen Z are different again, and that the world will never be the same. Half of the hot takes on generational differences or a war between the generations are simply, to be quite frank, rubbish, actually. And in fact, there's more difference between countries in terms of how they see things or consume things than there is between generations in any individual country. So that's the first thing. There are differences over things like attitudes to, I don't know, sexual identity, But in terms of what people want at work, the differences between millennials and boomers or between Gen Z and Gen X, those are all massively exaggerated, to be honest. So I think you need to be really careful. So there are generational differences, but it's a very lazy shorthand. If you're really saying that the biggest thing that defines somebody is which 15-year gap they were born in compared to another 15-year gap, and that everybody born in a 15-year gap is going to be the same because they're all Gen Z or they're all millennials or they're all baby boomers, frankly, you're talking nonsense.
You mentioned previously the fact that kind of, okay, remote working's come in, but maybe by 2030, everyone will be back crammed into the workplace.
Yeah.
How much as a society are we actually challenging the status quo, or how much do you feel we've reacted to the circumstances and reacted to what's going on in front of us, and we will end up regressing back to where we were previously?
Oh no, I think people will be reappraising their whole need for how they use office space, what office space they rent, how people work. I think the hybrid model for knowledge workers, and we need to remember there's large numbers of people in the economy who never have the luxury of deciding where they're going to do their work. But for knowledge workers and people who can work remotely, I think it's clear that there's certain sort of work that you're better off doing on your own, being left with minimal distractions, and you might as well do that at home, right, and save yourself the 1-hour commute each way. But there are loads of other things that you need to do with other people. And I think what we haven't quite mastered yet is the balance between those two things, and particularly how we absorb new people into our organization. So in my organization, but I think in many, there's a lot of tacit knowledge. So there's stuff that, we don't sort of strictly teach you this stuff, but it's how we do things around here and how we behave. And certainly, at Ipsos, one of the things I've observed is that we've hired hundreds of people in lockdown. It coincided with a time when we were also trying to hire much more diverse sets of people with different, well, probably a slightly wider range of academic qualifications, if I'm brutally honest, and from less conventional backgrounds. And what that's meant is, particularly doing that in lockdown, is that there are loads of people who don't really know, who work in the organization, who don't really quite know how they're supposed to behave in a particular setting, because they haven't been to Downing Street over the last 2 years, because there aren't any physical meetings, and they just don't know what's meant to happen in certain settings. So I think we really will need to think about that. But I think it's healthy if we're reappraising how we do things. But it's turning out that for many people, we don't need to be physically together all the time. But I think we are going to miss some of that. And we're still living off the social capital that we built before the pandemic in many cases. And it's going, so it is going to be a moment of change.
Is that kind of going to be led by individuals, or do companies have a responsibility?
Oh no, companies need to do what they need to do to get things done. And of course, if you're looking at something from my perspective as a CEO, I can see, one of the things that our data shows us is that young people say that there's a very strong age gradient, and the younger you are at work, the more likely you are to say that you need to be with other people to get your work done. So there's an acknowledgement that you're learning stuff and you need to be with other people, much higher for a 25-year-old than a 55-year-old. But what's interesting is that the 25-year-olds are almost as likely as the 55-year-olds to say that they, despite living in smaller homes, they're still as likely to say they want to work at home a lot and not to be in the office all the time. And I think there is going to come a moment where somebody's going to say, for the good of the business, you are going to spend 3 days a week, 4 days a week, whatever it is, together with some people doing certain things. And we're going to have to impose that, because otherwise there'll be a challenge. But there is a real difficulty. My colleague who runs our North American business is saying, I've got people saying, well, I've been told your competitors are telling me I can live in Idaho and work in New York, and I can live in Idaho and pay virtually no rent for as long as I like. I never have to go to New York ever again. And so what are you going to offer me? Or do I take the Idaho job? Much better quality of life for some people. And so, there's some businesses will put some pressure on people, but particularly for skills that are particularly in demand, like data scientists. You want to work in the Pacific? I don't care. You can live on the North Pole and work for me if you're a data scientist. It's fine. So it will depend. I think there'll be both employers demanding stuff, but employees at the moment in the labour market are also able to make some demands.
And Paige, thank you so much indeed for your time today. It's been a pleasure speaking to you as always.
Thank you very much.
No worries.